In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to draw a portrait using toned paper with black and white pencils. Before we talk about how to draw a portrait, let's talk about what materials we'll be using. You're going to need your charcoal pencils in a range of hardnesses, starting from medium to soft, and then you're also going to need your white chalk pencil. Make sure that your white chalk pencil is sharpened the same way your charcoal pencils are long. Besides your white and your black materials, you're also going to need some blending stumps. I have some here of different sizes. And then you want to make sure that you have some blending stumps that are only used for white chalk. So if you have some blending stumps that you've already used for charcoal, don't use those. Try to get some clean ones. But if you can't get more, you can clean up your blending stumps by using a little bit of sandpaper. So here I had a little bit of charcoal and I sandpapered it off and then used my paper towel to clean off the stump so that I can use it for white chalk. So I have a couple of blending stumps. You want to keep them separate, right? So use the charcoal only for charcoal, and then this white blending stump is going to be only for my white chalk. Besides that, you're going to need your erasers, your kneaded and your hard erasers, your X-Acto knife to sharpen the pencils, and then something really important about this toned paper. This is Canson Mi-tientes paper in the steel gray color. This paper comes in two sizes. It has two sides to it. It has a smoother side and it has a rougher side. And just to show the rough texture, I put a little bit of charcoal here. Sometimes you're not going to be able to see it until you actually apply charcoal to it. The smooth side is usually the sticker side and the side you want to use. Ultimately, it's a stylistic choice, but the texture side has texture to it, which is not particularly good for portrait, rendering skin tones, delicate values, details, soft transitions. It is good for other things. So if you want a bold drawing, if you want a paper surface that holds a lot of charcoal, this might be the side for you, right? So you can usually feel it. Like this paper is going to feel a little bit rougher on this side than the other side. Or you can hold it at an angle to the light, and I don't know if I can do that. Okay, it's starting to pick up a little bit of texture. But the best way is just to check it, right? If you're not sure what side to use, smear charcoal on one side and the other. You'll notice right away where the rougher side is. All right, so let me show you the fundamentals of this technique. We're going to start off with a simple value scale, like this. So it's going to be all the way black on this side and white on this side. So obviously to go darker, you're going to use your charcoal pencils. Let's blend this down a little bit. And notice what happens when I blend the charcoal. Notice that the value gets considerably darker. What's happening here is when you first apply the charcoal, it sits on top of the paper fibers and a lot of the paper is shining through. When you use the blending stump, it flattens the charcoal, makes it more opaque, and darkens the value. This is something that all of you are going to have to anticipate. The tendency of the charcoal to darken when you blend it. Okay, so I'm going lighter, 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 and then I'm going to try to use my blending stump to blend the charcoal into the gray of the paper, like this. Let's apply a little bit more charcoal. One thing you'll find is that the toned paper takes charcoal really well. It has a lot of tooth to it. It grips the charcoal fibers, so the paper is going to get really dark. You're going to be able to get really strong darks using this technique. And then to go lighter, I'm obviously going to use my white chalk. So let's start off with the white chalk. I'm applying less and less pressure, and you'll find that the white chalk works almost exactly the same way as the charcoal. So now let's use the stump that I only use for white chalk to blend it. And then I'm going to blend the white into the gray of the paper. Apply a little bit more. Okay, and then for the extremes, I'm going to apply a little bit of charcoal on this side, a little bit of white chalk on this side, and then I have my value scale. The extremes of both dark and light, you don't want to blend out. Why? Because if I blend, you'll notice there is a softening effect. Right? So I rub off a little bit of the white chalk and it dampens the extreme light. And the same thing happens in the darks. So I've got a really strong dark here, and if I use my blending stump, it actually lightens it and grays it out a little bit. So for the very last bumps, very last steps of light and dark, don't blend the value. It's going to make your drawing a little bit punchier, a little bit more contrasty. So what did we learn through this value scale? Well, first of all, that this paper takes both black and white material, drawing material, really well. It has a lot of texture to it. It's grippy. The somewhat contradictory thing about drawing is that sometimes the rougher paper can actually give you smoother results. Why? It's grippier. The charcoal, it takes the charcoal better. You're able to move it around more effectively than smoother paper. So with smoother paper, you might not be able to go as dark because the paper fibers won't accept quite as much drawing material. That's the first thing we learn. The second thing you learn is, well, look at the strong range of contrast here. Right? This is about as strong a contrast as you can get using any kind of drawing material. Right? Obviously, white paper with black ink, you can get very strong contrast as well. But it's really easy to achieve really strong contrast when you're working on tone paper. So there's absolutely no excuse to get a drawing with really strong contrast. And it's part of what makes this particular way of working really good for rendering all kinds of really strong contrasting drawings, but also reflective objects, glass. This is really effective for all kinds of different subject matter. The third and probably most important thing is that as much as possible, I'm going to let the paper do the work of being the midtone. So we've got charcoal on this side, we've got white on this side, and then right here where there's transition between light and dark, the paper is showing through. So every time you're seeing this value, you're going to add neither charcoal nor white. You're going to let the paper do the work. So for this particular method, and there's other methods which we'll talk about in a second, you don't want your charcoal to overlap with your white. The white can be adjacent to the charcoal, so if we have some kind of really strong transition, you can place the white next to it, like so. Right? But anytime we have some kind of gradual transition, where it transitions from darker to mid-tone to lighter, we have the paper in between. So for this particular technique, let the paper do the work. Now, there are other methods where you blend the black and the white material together, but watch what happens. When you mix the black and the white together, it creates a different color. Right? It creates a slightly cooler, slightly bluer gray, which means you have to do it everywhere. And this technique is a little bit different. It's more opaque. Nothing wrong with doing this, but this is the faster method, and in some ways the prettier method, the cleaner method of working. Okay, so let me show you how this works in practice using a simple sphere. So let's draw a sphere here. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that our light source is running slightly from the top at a 45-degree angle. We're going to find the light break using our charcoal. Use the side of the pencil. Do not put a dark line here. Don't do it. Okay. Find the light break, that's separation between lights and darks, and also indicate your cast shadows. Anytime you're shading, it really helps to break down the problem. And the first part of the problem is where to shade. Where are the shadows? Where are the body shadows? Where are the cast shadows? Okay. Now I'm going to start shading the shadow side. Let's see, let me use a pencil extender here. That's going to allow me to get a better angle. Hold the pencil way back like this. That's going to allow you to put very, very little pressure into the stroke, because we're going to try to be as gradual as possible. So I'm going to shade a little bit. You can shade the body and the cast shadow at the same time, like so. I'm working light because as soon as I start blending this, let me use a larger blender here. I've got my jumbo blender. You'll notice that the value gets darker. Now, if you remember, body shadows have soft edges. I'm going to use my blending stump to transition the shadow I just put down into the gray of the paper. We need a soft transition here, right? For cast shadows, what kind of edge do cast shadows have? Cast shadows usually, depending on the light source of course, have sharp edges. Okay, what's the next step? To add a little bit of white. So here's the principle of using this technique. You're going to shade a little bit, add a little bit of white. Shade a little bit more, add a little bit more white. This is very important because it's very difficult to see what values are in isolation, just by themselves. In order to figure out exactly how dark the shadow needs to go, I need to compare it to the lighter side of the sphere. Right? In order to figure out how light I need to go, I need to compare it to the shadow side of the sphere. So it's only through comparison of value do I actually get the values right. Which is why it's important to do both lights and darks almost at the same time. Impossible to do them at exactly the same time, but to alternate between your shadows and the lights. So I'm going to add a little bit of white, and then this transition where the light goes into the shadow, I'm going to let the gray do the work. I'm not covering this area with white. I'm letting it be. As much as possible, let the paper do the job of being the midtone. So I'm going to add a little bit of white. Then I'm going to use my white blending stump to blend it out a little bit. And then I'm going to transition the white into the gray of the paper. Okay, I've added a little bit of white. Now it's time to go back into the shadows and go a little bit darker. So what am I doing now? I'm putting in the components of my body shadow. What needs to be there? I need to see a core. That's going to be a darker value here. Right? And then I need to show the fact that the cast shadow is darker at the point of origin, at the occlusion point right here. And then it gets a little bit darker going this way. Sneak up on the values little by little. Remember that with the blending, the values go darker. So if I go really, really dark with the pencil alone, I'll find that when I start blending, it's going to end up too dark. Okay, what else am I looking for? So it's darker here, and also, one thing I forgot to do at the beginning, cast shadows tend to diffuse, to get softer as they move away from the casting object, so we want to fuzz out the shadow edge. Okay, so I put in a little bit of coarse shadow, I shade a little bit more, and now I'm going to start pushing a little bit more towards the lights. What am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for the lightest light. That's where the sphere is most directly facing the light source. That's going to be over here somewhere. Let's blend that down a little bit. And now back to the shadow. So what am I going to do? Well, I might go a little bit darker in the coarse shadow here. I might go a little bit darker in the cast shadow. So now I'm starting to get the extremes, right? So I'm pushing almost towards the end of my range of values. Let's use my blending stump. And then at this point I can start putting in that really dark accent, the occlusion where it goes really dark. That part I'm not going to blend. Right? And now I'm going to start going into the lighter part of the sphere and finishing the sphere in the lighter part. How many times you move back and forth, it's really up to you. The whole point is to move back and forth until you're completely done. You have a full range of values. So now I'm going to put in my highlight, and the highlight I don't blend down because I want it really, really strong. Okay. All right. With this technique, you can see that you can get a full range of value very quickly. This paper blends excellently. Right? You can keep working, and get very smooth, almost airbrush-like effects if you want. Right? It is very erasable, so if you have any kind of mistakes, it erases really well. However, once you have a lot of value down, you've got a lot of charcoal, you have the extremes of light and dark, it becomes harder and harder to erase. So with this technique, you want to sneak up on it a little bit more. Make sure you do a careful drawing with just charcoal. Make sure that that drawing is correct in terms of the placement, proportions, before you move on. Because at the very later stages, it's going to become more painful. First of all, you've done more work. You've spent more hours. You've dug yourself into a deeper hole with a mistake. So it's just going to become more painful to correct. And also, those corrections are always going to leave a little bit of residue behind. What else? Well, okay, that's it. So those are the fundamentals of this technique. Now we can move on to actually drawing a portrait. Now that we know how to use this technique, let's start on our portrait. I'm going to have my reference on the left side of the screen, right here. Let's start it with our oval. Like so. And in this case, because I'm facing this way, I'm going to off-center my composition slightly and move my oval slightly to the right. As a rule, when you have a face that's facing this way, you want to leave more room on that side. Because if I move it over, it's going to feel like I'm staring into a corner, which is uncomfortable and not good for the composition. Okay, let's find our center line. Here's our center line, right about here. And now I'm going to put in my eye level. Now, if you remember in the construction, I said that eye level is going to be pretty close to the middle of the head, somewhere here. If I'm interested in making my head, my portrait drawing look human, then I'm just going to place it in the middle. However, if I want to get a perfect likeness, or something close to it, I'm going to make sure to figure out exactly where that eye level is. Where is that line exactly? It might be higher on some people, it might be lower on some people. This is something that I need to measure. So what I'm going to do is use my proportion measuring tool, and I'm going to compare two distances. The distance from the chin to the eye against the distance from the eye to the top of the head. I'm going to ask myself, which one is longer? Usually, on most people, eye level runs either in the middle or a little bit higher. Really rarely does it run lower. That means that somebody has a very, very big forehead. So what I'm doing is I'm using my proportion measuring tool. I'm lining up my pencil with the eye, the middle of the eye, sliding my thumb down so it lines up with the chin, and then moving my arm up so that my thumbnail is where the tip of the pencil used to be. And then I look up and see where the tip of the pencil is. How much higher is it? Then I sketch in my eye level this way, and I make sure that the proportions are the same. So when I did the measurement, the tip of my pencil hovered somewhere here above my head. I want to make sure that my eye level is approximately in the same place. Right? Okay, so I have my center line, I have my eye level. Now I can start sketching the brow line. Where the eye level intersects with my center line, I'm going to start sketching in my brow line. And I'm using very simple angles here. I'm not going into detail. I'm looking for the angle of the brow at the forehead, and then where it shifts angle to the temple, like this. What we're doing right now is construction. We're not going into detail. I'm just trying to make sure that everything is in the right place. So look for big angles. Keep it really light, because there's going to be a lot of construction, obviously, and we don't want this construction to build up and interfere with all the detail we put on top. Okay, here is the chin. Here is my brow line. Now I'm going to find the base of the nose. Now, if you remember for the construction video, I said that the base of the nose is somewhere in the middle of this distance right here. However, to get a portrait, I need to figure out exactly where the base of the nose is. So I'm going to, again, use my proportion measuring tool and measure these two distances against each other and figure out which one is longer and by how much. So once again, my pencil goes to the chin, except now the tip of my pencil lines up with the base of the nose. And now I'm going to move my arm up so the base of the nose is lined up with my thumbnail. And I'm going to look up and look where the tip of the pencil is. Okay, so in my portrait, in my reference, this distance is a little bit longer than this distance. Okay, good. I'm going to place it a little bit higher up so that this distance is ever so slightly longer than this distance. Okay, now I'm going to start using, again, simple angles to sketch in some of the details of the face. So we're going to deal with the nose here. Again, you can see how simple these angles are. I'm not going into detail. I'm just trying to get the placement right. It's very difficult to figure out whether you're drawing things correctly until you have everything placed. So often, once I've placed everything, there's going to be a process of moving things around, saying, okay, the nose needs to be a little bit longer, or I need a little bit more space here or there. Working on things in isolation is a mistake. So I'm going to place the nose. I'm going to assume that it's close. However, I'm not going to be able to know until the eyes are in, until the mouth is in, and the likeness starts appearing. Okay, so now let's start working for the line of the mouth. And once again, we're going to compare two distances against each other. So the distance from the base of the nose to the middle of the mouth, against the middle of the mouth to the chin. Now clearly, this distance on me is shorter, but this is something that's measurable. I can compare those two distances together and find out which one is longer. When you're drawing a subject from a distance, these distances start becoming difficult to measure. This is something I recommend you start to kind of eyeball estimate, as opposed to using your proportion measuring tool. So for me, I think the line of my mouth is somewhere here, like this. Now we can start sketching in the mouth. If you guys remember, again from the construction videos, that the middle of the mouth is pushed slightly forward. It's not lined up with the center line. Why? Because the teeth push forward on the skull, creating a little half circle here. Okay, so here's my mouth, here's my chin. Okay, next step is to start placing the eyes. Again, that rule where the nostril ends, the eye begins is very useful here. But it's going to vary on everybody. So to get a likeness, I need to figure out exactly where the alignment is between the nostril and the inside of the eye. So I'm going to hold my pencil vertically here against the reference and see where the nostril lines up. Okay, so the nostril and the tear duct, that little BB shape on the inside of the eye, are aligned. Okay? That means that the eye is going to start somewhere here. And on the other side, I can see the nostril, and it's sitting slightly behind the nostril here, right, the inside of the eye. As far as the length here, I can use an angle measurement. So I can measure from base of the nose to here and figure out that angle. Okay, here's the angle going this way. Okay, here's one eye. Let's get the other angle. All those simple measuring tools you guys use at the very way at the beginning of the class are usable for the portrait, right? Vertical, horizontal alignments, your angle measurements, obviously, your proportion measuring, super important. Okay, now I'm going to start carving into the face a little bit in the front. Goes in this way. We have the cheekbone, the cheek, the chin, and I need to get the rest of the head here. So how do I figure out where the back of the head is? Measure the proportions. So I'm going to measure from here to the back of the head on my reference, and then I'm going to compare it to the height. Okay, so when I do that, I realize the distance from here to here roughly runs to right about, let me check that again, make sure I got it right. Yeah, so slightly past the brow line here. So I'm going to take this distance, carry it over. Okay, so we need just a little bit of extra depth here, a little bit of extra room here for the cranium. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the jawline. So I'm going to measure from the jawline to the cheekbone and compare that to the height of the head. It looks like it reaches to right about here. So take that distance, carry it over, and now you can start sketching in your cheekbone, your jawline. And now we can start placing the ears. So for the ears, use your horizontal alignment tool. I'm going to line up my pencil with the top of the ear, see where it lines up against the eye, right about here. Then do the same thing for the earlobe. For me, it lines up with the upper lip here, and now we can sketch in the ear, the neck. Don't go into detail until you know exactly what the composition needs to be. Okay, we have hair. I'm going to block it in a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to look at my overall proportions. Do I have the starting point of a likeness? Well, it doesn't quite look like me yet because the forms are very, very generic, but I can see that the proportions are correct, and I can start moving into rendering the details. Okay, so now let's start drawing the details in. I'm going to start really anywhere. You can start anywhere you want, but I usually start with the nose. Guys, really important, when you're rendering facial features, facial details, try to use as little line as possible. Right? The fact is, lines don't really exist in nature, or they very rarely exist in nature. And especially with the human form, right, the less lines you use, the more realistic the effect. Right? So there are a few places where we have sharp excuse me, where we have sharp lines. Inside the nostrils, maybe a little bit, a few details inside the eye, the line of the mouth, but most often what you're seeing instead of a line is just a simple value transition, either sharp or soft. So I'm being really, really gentle here and trying to avoid putting in lines. Right, you can see that the lines I'm putting in, or the features I'm putting in, are soft. So what I'm actually doing is I'm drawing with shading. Right, we have a sharp edge here, right, but I'm not putting in really sharp lines. This is one of the worst things you can do is outline everything. Right, so when it comes to the lips, also, right, use a soft edged indication of the shape of the lips. Don't put in a lot of sharp detail. Right, don't outline everything. And our blending stump is going to really help with this. So once I've drawn the features, I can start blending things out a little bit. Right? Okay, so there is our nose. Okay, let's start drawing this eye. I'm going to move it a little bit in this way. You see I'm not outlining the eye. I'm not being really, really sharp and linear. All right, I'm keeping things really soft. Okay, let's do the other eye. Okay, let's place the lips, the little depression above the upper lip. Okay, let's draw the ear. You can see I'm keeping things light and not putting in a lot of sharp lines. Okay, now we're going to start rendering a little bit. Guys, if you remember from our shading demo, what do we need to do before we start actually applying value? We need to figure out where the shadows actually are. So we're going to follow the shape of the light break. I'm going to make an indication of it on the reference here. Right? There's a strong, clear shape to it. Use the side of your pencil. Don't put a sharp line there either. And find the light break. So light break runs like this. Then it goes this way. Then it runs across the top of my nose. Then we have a half spherical shape here at the tip of the nose. Right, so it's going to run like this way. If you remember from our light logic demo, what kind of shadow do we have here? This is a body shadow. So body shadows need to have soft transition. And then we have a few cast shadows. Here's a cast shadow. What kind of edges do cast shadows need to have? They need to be sharp. Right? So we have soft body shadows, body shadows, body shadows, and then we have sharp cast shadows. Pay attention to the shape of the shadow and the kind of shadow you're looking at. Again, if it is a body shadow like we have here, we're going to have a soft transition this way. Then this little bump on my forehead is casting a little shadow here, like this, and the cast shadow is turning into a body shadow this way. Be as specific about the shape of the light break and the kind of shadows you're seeing. We have a shadow shape here, right? We have a body shadow here going this way, then a little cast shadow. Then here we have a body shadow, cast shadow, and another body shadow right here. So it's forming this little interesting shadow shape, right? Then the eye is casting a shadow here, and we have some cast shadows here that are sharp, right? Pay very close attention to the shadow shapes at the beginning of your drawing. It's going to make things a lot easier as you shade. In drawing anything complicated requires, or actually anything simple, requires you to break things down to simple steps. So if I try to tackle everything at once, it becomes very quickly overwhelming. Right? Don't get overwhelmed. Do one thing at a time. One task at a time. That's going to allow you to do each separate task better and ultimately get a better drawing. As with anything complicated, being systematic really helps. So a lot of the drawing instruction I give you, isn't really about skill. It's about having the correct mindset. The correct mindset to always be making corrections. The correct mindset to always be systematic in the way you work. Always seek out mistakes. Always be ready to make corrections at really any stage in your drawing. If you have the correct mindset, the skill will come. It'll arrive. If you have the wrong mindset, it's going to be hard to acquire the skills that I show you. Right? So being systematic, constantly correcting mistakes, right? Working light at the beginning, right? Working step by step. Really important in this process. Okay, I've indicated my major light breaks. Now I'm going to start shading a little bit. If you guys remember, I'm going to shade a little bit, add a little bit of white. Shade a little bit more, add a little bit more white. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth in my drawing and building up the value and detail little by little. So let's start shading. I'm going to use the side of my pencil. I don't want to go too dark. I'm already working on a relatively dark surface, right? So it's not going to take that much to get fairly dark values. Okay, we have a cast shadow here that I forgot about. It's going this way. Okay, and then even though we have lighter values here, all of this is part of the shadow value. So I'm going to very lightly indicate the fact that we have a shadow here. And again, remember, when I stump, the value goes darker. Right? So I don't want to go too dark right away, because if I do, I'll find that when I stump, it's going to get darker still and go too dark. Okay, so I have, let's put this in, my general shadows in. This looks like it's going this way a little bit. Okay. All right. Now let's do some stumping. You can see how much darker the value becomes when I stump. Pay attention to the shadow edge. Where you're seeing a body shadow, make sure you have a soft transition. Where you see a cast shadow, you can sharpen that transition up. Okay. See how I sharpen that up a little bit? Right, don't press down too much with the stump. It doesn't take that much to smooth things out. And if I really press down, I'm going to destroy all the drawing that I've done underneath. Right, you can see there's a softening effect when you stump, and it might eliminate some of the drawing. You can always be reinforced, of course, but that's not something you want to lose. Okay, so I'm paying attention to what kind of edge am I seeing? Is it soft or is it sharp? Everyone, shadow edges will vary. So on forms that are abrupt, that are narrow, like here, right? You can see that the shadow edge it's not sharp, but it transitions very quickly. Here, where the forms are more rounded, the body shadows are a little bit softer, right? They spread out over a larger area and become a little bit softer. Okay, so I've erased a little bit, I've shaded a little bit, excuse me. Now I'm going to start adding a little bit of white. Really important. Before you add white, make sure you erase out all the charcoal in those areas. It's going to make the drawing cleaner. We don't need them, also. If you remember, where charcoal and white meet, it creates a third color, and that's not something we need in the drawing. So white and charcoal, the white chalk and the charcoal, should not overlap. Keep them separate from each other. Okay, let's add a little bit of white chalk. Make sure your white chalk is sharpened properly. And we're just going to add a little bit of chalk everywhere we see light. Just a little bit. Now, here we have a value transition. We're dealing with a body shadow here. Do not let the white overlap, so leave a little bit of that gray tone. You can see at this stage I'm not drawing facial hair. I'm not going to do that until I start dealing with the surface detail, with wrinkles, all that stuff. We'll talk about hair a little bit later in the demo, towards the end. At this point, I'm going to pretend like it's not there. Okay, why do I put it there? Why do I put white? So I can compare the shadows against the white. So now that I have a little bit of white value, I'm also going to blend it down. It's barely there. It's very soft. It's mostly for value comparison. It's so I can compare one value against the other. So you may have noticed that when I first put in the shadows, before I added white, they maybe didn't feel like they were dark enough, like they could have gone a lot darker. Now I've got the white next to it, because of the contrast, the shadows appear darker. So this whole process is all about bouncing back and forth so that I can make value comparisons. Now that I know what the value generally needs to be in the white, with the exception of brighter values, highlights, details, all that stuff. Now I can start going back in the shadows and make more accurate decisions. So next step here is to go back in the shadows, start looking for core shadows, start looking for darker values, start looking for details. Right? So everywhere we have body shadows, there are cores. Right? So here's a core shadow. Here's a core shadow. Here's a core shadow. Here we have a little cast shadow. It's sharper here. And then we have a core shadow running all the way along the length of the nose. Again, I'm going to stump this. I don't want to go too dark here. So apply a little bit and stump it and see if you've gone dark enough. Right? Okay, the blending stuff itself is a drawing tool. It doesn't just blend, it also darkens in this case, in this technique. You can start putting in some of the details in the eye socket. So I'm going a little bit darker here. Just defining the eye, got smeared out a little bit. There's a little shadow underneath the lower eyelid here. The brow itself is a little bit darker. Right, there's a little shadow right here. So we can start going in and putting in a little bit of shadow here and there. Right? It's a little bit darker underneath the nose. Why? We have a cast shadow, and cast shadows are darker where they start, and then they start to diffuse out a little bit. We have a body shadow here and a cast shadow on this side. That needs to go a little bit darker. A cast shadow on the lower lip. A cast shadow underneath the lower lip, turning into a body shadow here. Okay, we have a core shadow here. Let's redefine some of the details that I lost a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to take my blending stump and go a little bit darker. By the way, if your blending stump is already kind of dirty, you can use it to draw. Right? You can use it to actually apply value. Okay. So again, you can see how I'm holding off on finishing, applying a lot of detail, right? And I'm trying to be really soft. I'm blending everything out. I'm avoiding sharp lines. Right? Don't put in sharp lines. They're usually not there. Again, there's a few exceptions. Usually they're not there. Okay, we shade a little bit more. We can see we're starting to get a slightly stronger three-dimensional quality. Let's start going into some of our lights little by little. So one thing I notice is that the shadow shape here is not quite right. So I'm going to erase it out a little bit. I'm going to make a few little corrections here. This way. And then there might be some areas where the white can be erased or added to. So just refining the shape of the head a little bit. But now we can start looking for areas that go a little bit darker or areas that go a little bit lighter. So for instance, there's a little shadow right here, not a shadow, a halftone, right, that can go a little bit darker. I can use my kneaded eraser to erase it out. Going this way, it's going a little bit darker here, like this. So I'm defining, what I'm starting to do is starting to define some of the forms in the light. Right, it's going a little bit darker here, a little darker here. On the cheekbone, it might be going a little bit darker. Here, it starts going a little bit darker. So I'm erasing those areas out and letting the paper do the work of creating those soft transitions, those halftones. And now we can start going a little bit lighter. So we have a highlight here. We can start putting that in a little bit. Like that. There's a highlight here. Right, it's starting to go a little bit lighter here. Let's erase out a little bit here. We're getting rid of the charcoal. Right, there's a lighter value right here. And sort of an interesting double highlight here, right? So there's a highlight underneath the eye here, and then another one right on the cheekbone right here. This way. There's a little highlight here. Little highlight right here. Some areas that go a little bit that need to go a little bit lighter. Maybe a little bit of white on the cheek itself. Okay, there's a little highlight on the eye. Maybe I need to draw the eye a little bit more in order to figure out where that highlight is. So let's do that. This way. Okay, so there's a little highlight on the eye right here, like this. There we go. Okay, so I've added a little bit more white. Can add a little bit to the lips as well. There's a little bit of a highlight here. And a little bit here. Put this way. Okay, you can see that I'm still constantly looking for mistakes, still constantly looking to fix, improve my drawing. And if I catch a mistake, I'm going to absolutely make the correction. Okay, so one thing you'll find is that professional artists make as many mistakes as you do. They just fix them really quickly, right? They're constantly scouring their drawing and making sure that everything is right. Right? A lot of you, this often happens with beginners, you get kind of locked in thinking, oh, okay, maybe it's not important, or maybe I'll correct it later, or it's just too painful to correct because you've already spent several hours on it. Always be in the mindset of trying to improve your drawing, trying to make corrections, right? As soon as you catch a mistake, fix it. It doesn't really matter how long it took you, right? How painful it is. And believe me, I've been there, right? You're working on something for 8 hours and then suddenly you realize, oh my God, the eye is not in the right place, or I made some kind of horrible compositional mistake and I need to make the correction, or even sometimes even start over, right? It gets less painful over time. Let's put it this way, right? You don't take your works quite so personally. You're not quite as attached to it over time. And once you get that mindset, you'll find that making corrections is easier. Okay, now I'm going to go back in the shadows and start getting specific in the detail. So this is where I need to start kind of aging myself a little bit, right? Putting in the bags underneath my eyes here. This whole area needs to go a little bit darker. We've got some darker shadows here. Here inside the orbital socket, or around the orbital socket, it starts going darker. Okay, let's start blending that down a little bit. Okay, some of these core shadows need to go a little bit darker. You can see I'm being systematic, building up the values little by little and adding detail little by little. So we have the cheekbone here. Okay, and it's darker underneath the nose here. Okay, and I can start adding some of the reflections that are coming from this direction. How do I do it? Well, definitely I'm not going to use white. I'm going to use my eraser, and if I have my little eraser holder, let's see if I can find it here. That's going to make things a lot easier. Let's see. Looking for my eraser holder, not finding it. Okay, here it is. So having a little eraser holder really helps with some of the details. Okay, so we have some reflected lights here. You can start putting them in. All right, there's a little reflection on the nostril here. There might be situations where you're going to put white in shadow areas. So I'm thinking maybe like on the reflections on the hair here. Maybe. But generally speaking, your eraser is going to do a good enough job. All right, so I'm revealing the paper tone here. And because we've got a lot of dark values here, you'll notice that it actually looks like the reflected light. There's a little reflected light here, on the side of my face, on my cheekbone here. Right. Where else? Okay, well here. Right, there's a little bit of reflected light here. I have to be gentle. For areas that need to be soft, maybe the kneaded eraser is the more effective tool. Right. So some little reflected lights here. Tapping at it as opposed to rubbing will give you a softer feel. Okay, let's put in some of those reflected lights in the other eye. You got some very, very strong, bright reflected lights. But even in those areas where you've got those strong reflected lights, don't use white. Right? Allow the paper tone to be the reflected light value. Some reflections in the eye itself. Okay, Now let's go back into the lights and get the full range of values. So we're looking for the brightest highlight here, like this. We already have a lot of this stuff. But now I'm really pulling out all the stops and getting the full range of value. Could be a little bit lighter on the neck as well. And let's go back into the shadows and start getting the full range of darks. Now is the time to put in any kind of sharp details if there are any, right? So some of the sharper details might be the eye here. It goes really dark. Right, there might be a little sharp detail here in the upper eyelid. Maybe inside the tear duct it starts going a little bit darker. If you can, try to do those things last and treat them as if you're working with some kind of precious spice. Right, you're cooking. Right, it's the seasoning stage at the end where you're adjusting, adding a little bit of lemon juice for acidity, a little sugar, whatever it is. Trying to balance things out. Don't use them at the beginning. So sharpening up some details here. Okay, so at this stage I'm going to start adding facial hair, eyebrows, all that kind of stuff. It can be a really tricky process. What I want is to first think about the general form and value of the facial hair as opposed to going in and putting in texture, right? So I'm going to start by pretending like the facial hair has no texture at all, right? So we have some facial hair here, going this way, it's going like this, going darker this way. Okay, let's blend it in a little bit in some places. Okay, let's do the same thing for my mustache. Going a little bit darker this way. Right, so one thing that helps is kind of blur your eyes a little bit and look at the general values that you're seeing there. Right, blur them out. Like so. And then you can start putting in details, right? So for the details, the most important thing to keep in mind is where the detail is closer to and where are they farther away. So they're farther away here, they're closer to here, and a little farther away here. The detail here needs to be stronger. The detail here needs to be a little bit stronger so you get a stronger three-dimensional effect, right? So here, you're going to keep the detail very soft, like so. Here, you're going to make the detail a little bit stronger. You can see I'm making the texture a little bit stronger here. The darks a little bit darker. Right? Here a little bit softer. Here a little bit darker. Right? Here a little bit softer. And the same thing for eyebrows, right? So fortunately, I don't have strong eyebrows or any eyebrows, right? But if you're going to put an eyebrow texture, first blur it out, and then make it stronger where it's closer to the viewer, which is here, here, and softer here. Be gentle, right? Facial hair texture can easily overwhelm your drawing, can easily take over and become stronger, right, than your forms. So you want to be really gentle, apply it little by little. I'm just going to darken this slip a little bit. Always something to do. Okay, and then blur it out in areas where things are far away. So here, a little bit softer, right? So here we're starting to get into my hair. So we can deal with hair. Look, with hair, the same exact thing applies, right? The same principles apply. So first you want to think about the general value and the general form of the hair. So I'm going to draw it in a little bit. I think my hair is pretty complicated because it's got a lot of white in it. But probably what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start off by making it darker at the beginning. Like this. And then here it generally transitions to a lighter value, so I'm going to use a little bit of white here. Like this. Trying not to overlap my lights and my darks as much as I can. Blur them out. So again, we're looking for the overall form and the general value of the hair. And now I can start picking out details, right? Where the hair is closest to you, so here, here, make the details stronger, make the texture stronger. Where it's farther away, make it softer. And the secret is I'm not trying to draw every single individual hair, right? I'm just putting in enough detail so that I'm suggesting the fact that we're dealing with hair, right? So a few of the larger strands going this way, going this way. We can soften them, blur them out a little bit. And then in my case, because I have a lot of white in my hair, I might want to use a little bit of white, but always, if you're going to add white, make sure that you erase out as much of the charcoal underneath. Otherwise, they're going to mix together and you're not going to get such a bright value. So here, for instance, I'm going to use a little bit of my eraser to erase out some of the highlights here. Like so. Maybe here a little bit. Right, definitely a lot here. So I'm using my eraser holder first. And then I can reinforce those values using my white chalk. Okay, just lowering my hairline. a little bit. Just a touch. Right, let's see. My forehead's a little bit lower. Okay. All right, guys. A couple of things to keep in mind. Right. This principle of keeping things sharper where they're closer to the viewer and softer where they're farther away applies to just about everything. So when it comes to facial features, where things are closer to you, make sure they have a little bit more contrast. Right. So this eye is closer to you. That eye should be a little bit sharper than this eye. Right. The hair should be a little bit sharper here than it is back here. Why? Because it's closer here. Right? This is one of those little tricks that gives your drawing a stronger sense of three-dimensionality than is actually there in your portrait. Okay. Put in a little more detail here. All right. Okay, guys, very, very important. For your assignment, make sure that you don't just do a head study, that you're thinking about every part of your composition. So I'm not going to do it because I'm going to be here for the next couple of hours. But guys, make sure that you shade your shoulders, right? So draw a little bit of your shirt, your torso. Draw all the way down, right? So fill the entire paper with something, right? So don't just leave a floating head study. All right, so I'm not going to do it now. Again, it's going to take a little bit too much time. Folds, right? These kind of strong dynamic folds add movement to the composition. And, make it feel more finished. And compositionally do a good job moving the eye to where I want it to go, which is my face. Also deal with the background, right? So for me, we have a lighter value here, right? For these larger blends, if you don't have a large enough blending stump, this is why I asked you guys to also have a paper towel. Use a paper towel to do it. Right? It does as fine a job as your blending stumps and is better for these kind of larger value transitions. Right? The same thing goes for dark. So let's say we have a slightly darker value up here. Right? As opposed to using a blending stump, use your paper towel. Okay, well that's my portrait. Obviously it's not complete, but I think you guys know what to do at this point, right? So most importantly, right, finish every part of the drawing, background, the shirt, right, put in whatever details you want, and then you'll have a complete work of art as opposed to just a study. Right? We're always trying to work towards getting something that looks complete. Right? Sorry, just drawing these fun little curls. Okay, all right, that's the demo. Thank you for watching, and looking forward to seeing all of your assignments.